So, Paddy Cuneen.
Paddy Cuneen.
I have just seen your incredible, brilliant play, Fleeto. I'm still very moved by it. So I'm very honoured to be speaking to you.
You're very welcome.
And you also directed the play.
That's right, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about it, Fleeto.
Fleeto is a play which I wrote a couple of years ago in response to a kind of sensationalised reports in the media about issues surrounding knife crime in Glasgow, particularly, which is where I live. And my intention was really to try and examine the issue in a way that I felt the press weren't doing. So really it's a story which, because I don't have much experience of that kind of world, it's a story which I kind of built around the idea of the Iliad. Because it always struck me that in Homer's Iliad we have Greek gangs, effectively gangs of Greeks murdering and killing gangs of Trojans who are equally, and it was like gang warfare. This took place over the whim, because of a whim of a woman who decided she didn't want to live with a Greek, she wanted to be married to a Trojan. So off she went, and these gangs went to war, and somehow literature has enshrined that as an amazing and a cultural high point, the idea that of the Iliad. And I wondered why we weren't viewing street crime the same way, because it was effectively similarly motivated, and in some ways, you know, not a great rationale underpinning the violence. So I took that idea, and I wanted to give the audience a sense of what it might be like to be a young disaffected man brought up in areas with high indexes of deprivation, without much feeling of autonomy, and a great sense of frustration and injustice, and how a young man like that might feel compelled to run with a gang. So the story is centered around a young man called Mackie who hears that his friend's been slashed. He wants to take revenge and is sucked into a gang. Before he knows it, he runs with that gang, and even though he doesn't know who perpetrated the crime on his friend, revenge at all costs, he goes off and he runs with the gang, ends up killing somebody with a knife. And the play then shifts perspective slightly and looks at the consequences of all of that action. Firstly, on the young man himself, on the family of the man who's been murdered, and we do that through a contact with the victim's mother, who is told by a police officer that her son has been killed. And then, because she doesn't know how to deal with it, she goes wandering around Glasgow, driving around, looking at places of deprivation, because she's never thought about it before. She's a well-heeled middle-class woman, never had to think about the issue of poverty in her own city. And the next thing, her son's been killed, and she wants to know about the roots of this kind of violence and why it's young disaffected working class lads that are doing this, and not middle class lads. So she goes looking for areas where areas of deprivation where these young men come from, and after having driven around Glasgow for 8 hours in a kind of daze, she ends up in the very place, of course, because it's theatre, she ends up in the very place where the young man who's killed her son finds himself, and they meet, and they have a short moment where they try to understand each other, and try to come to terms with each other's world and how they're connected. And eventually Mackie, our young guy who's done the murder, tries very hard to give the mother something that she needs, some comfort, and in the end is compelled to give her the notebook of her son's notebook, in which is written down the story of his life. So that's his journey. He is full of remorse for what he's done, but when something like this is done, there's no undoing it, and that's what he does.
That was an extraordinary scene.
Thank you.
Between, I mean, it was extraordinary in the way that it was written, but also, you know, the performances.
One of the things I'm always interested in performance is the ability that the actors have to make the audience feel and imagine what's going on, rather than to simply present it. And I think that makes going to the theatre an active an active experience for the audience rather than a passive one. So the acting style that I've encouraged is one in which, for example, if the mother feels grief, it's important to repress that grief so that the audience feel it more than she shows it. They can sense by repressing it, somehow the audience feels it more intensely. I've been fortunate with the group of actors that we've got that they can all play that style where they are able to feel something very intensely and suppress it, so that the audience is aware of this great dilemma that's going on in the mind of the performer or of the character about what they say and what they do, and how that contrasts with what they're feeling. And that's where the idea of because obviously you would expect somebody who's told that their son has been killed to be extraordinarily emotional about it, and the fact that she represses all that makes it all the more traumatic for those around watching it in the audience, and that was the kind of the key issue there.
Well, I had to sit in the seat for 5 minutes after to stop crying, so you did that very well.
Well, thank you.
You began as a composer, and
that's right.
You moved into writing.
I did, yes. I worked as a composer for a long time. I have a long history working at the National Theatre in London and touring companies like Cheek by Jowl, which would come to Australia regularly. I moved to Glasgow and was frustrated by a lack of opportunities up there, so I decided that I should probably do something else, and I decided to write. So Fleeto's my first play, and since then, that was 5 years ago, nearly 5 years ago. Since then, I've written half a dozen stage plays and developing some more. So it's been a very nice change of gear for me.
So is Fleeto the sequel to? So we have behind you, we have We Andy. Is this? They're connected, yeah. We Andy.
They are, yes. We Andy is the character. We Andy is the character who you hear at the beginning of Fleeto. You hear that a young boy has been slashed. His name is Wee Andy, and that's what prompts Mackie to go on his chase for revenge, blind chase for revenge. But in Wee Andy, we tell the story of Wee Andy, what happened to this young lad who was slashed. The reason why I wrote the second play was that when we did Fleeto, we toured it around Scotland and took it into Polmont Young Offenders Institute, which is where all the young men convicted, and they mostly are young men who do this, all the young men convicted of knife crime go. So we were actually performing this in Polmont Prison with a group of convicted young men playing the gang, effectively playing themselves, and they were compelling in it. They were brilliant in the way they handled the work. They absolutely loved doing it. But the question they kept asking me was, what happened to Wee Andy? Because they were really worried about this character who is just a minor character mentioned at the beginning of Fleeto. They were obsessed with this character, and the reason was that although they were convicted of having committed knife crime and being very violent young men, and some of those men aren't coming out of jail for some of the things they've done, although that's the truth about them, there was another truth which they were revealing, which is that they felt that they were vulnerable they grew up within a culture of violence and had very little chance to do anything except toughen up or learn how to deal with it. So they were really concerned for Wee Andy because he seemed somehow in their minds to represent them. That is to say that they had no alternative but to toughen up in a world that is extremely hard and violent. Misguidedly, a lot of them said they carried a knife for self-defense and then used it and got into trouble. And in fact, most of the findings on knife crime seem to indicate that if you carry a knife, you're more likely to be for it to be used against you than it to be used in your self-defense.